So good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. I'm Carolyn Eswine. I'm an associate professor at the School of Architecture and Urban Planning here at UW-Milwaukee. I'm going to start with our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge in Milwaukee that we are on traditional Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee homeland along the southwest shores of Michigamme, North America's largest system of freshwater lakes, where the Milwaukee, Menominee, and Kinnickinnic rivers meet, and the people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present. So we're excited to have you here and encourage you to click on some of the links and understand your homeland and who was previously there. We are nearing the end of the semester. We have 2 more great events. If you're local, we encourage you to attend November 30th. We have 2 fellows from the Brookings Institution joining us to talk about breaking the urban doom loop and shared prosperity between downtowns and neighborhoods. And that's November 30th at 4 p.m. right here at UWM. And then our final Innovative Cities lecture for the semester will be Shifting Gears. We have Susan Handy sharing her new book. It's Transportation Alternative Thinking, and that will be December 6th, noon via Zoom. So I'm excited today. It's such a current event topic that we have to share with you, and it's equitable zoning. We have 3 great speakers representing both a national perspective and some local perspectives. So looking at both of those, and not just zoning, but in other policy changes, what are policy changes you can make to increase equity in your communities? So we are joined by Susan Henderson. She's an architect with Placemakers. She's done work in Wisconsin nationally and is currently working with the city of Milwaukee. We have Sam Leichtling, city of Milwaukee, and Tammy Szudy from city of Wauwatosa. So 2 local perspectives of work that's been previously done and currently right now. So we are going to kick it off with Susan. And I remind you, if you have a comment or question, please put it in the chat, and we will address your question either during the presentation or after all 3 speakers have presented. So Susan, I'll pass it to you. Welcome.
Thank you. So just to give you a little orientation, I'm going to briefly talk about the housing crisis, the needs we have, state best practices in Washington, with examples from Washington, California, and Vermont, and equitable zoning barriers that we've identified, and then some quick fixes that hopefully you can do within your community. So you're probably very familiar with the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies data projecting types of housing growth through 2040. And this is looking at Professor Chris Nelson's research indicating how types of housing were in need and demand over different eras. So from 1980 to 2010, 75% of all housing growth was in the 35 to 64-year-old demographic. So these were the people building families. There were people looking for single family, and frequently they were looking for some size of yard. And so at that time, the 20th century zoning codes that prioritized exclusionary zoning actually were meeting this demand effectively. But what we are seeing in a shift since 2010 is as the baby boomers are retiring and they're over 64, they're downsizing, they're moving into urban environments, that now we're seeing the housing type growth. 77% of all growth through 2040 is projected to be in that aging demographic. And the biggest problem we see as this generational shift progresses is that most US municipalities have restricted the types of housing that will fit that growing demand, and that could aid in resolving the problem. As the boomers sell their houses, they only have 19% of the growth that are looking to buy that housing type. Medium density housing is currently illegal in 75% of residentially zoned land in America. And that is just exacerbating this supply-demand problem. So with that as a backdrop, we are seeing some major changes at the state level. Washington's HB 1110 that was adopted just this summer, it's the second phase of their housing reform. It requires duplexes in all residential districts statewide. It requires 4 units for every residential district within a quarter mile of transit, and cities over 75,000 fourplexes are required in all residentially zoned areas, and 6 units within a quarter mile of transit. So it has additional standards and incentives for affordable housing. It addresses displacement concerns, and it also permits Commerce to provide grants for zoning updates to accommodate this change. And just quickly, Placemakers worked recently in Langley, Washington, and we did a multifamily form-based code overlay for all of their residential districts. And even though this community doesn't meet that 75,000 population minimum, they're allowing 4 to 6 units in their lowest density residential districts, and then up to 8 units in other districts, including 5,000 square foot single family district. So there are communities that are finding innovative ways to adapt to these responses and meet their state requirements. Next is in California, AB 2011 and SB 6. This is representatives and Senate together, and they permit housing along all commercial corridors that until now had been exclusionary of zoning. They streamline ministerial approval for 100% affordable housing and mixed income applications. And it must be multifamily, that's a minimum. And it also must meet, this redevelopment must meet density minimums based on context. And then finally, the one that, as a chair emeritus of the Congress for the New Urbanism, I have to say we're really proud of this one because CNU was engaged in the research and advocacy and developing guidance and support for this. This is the Home Act that Vermont passed in May of 2023. It allows duplexes in all residentially zoned districts and fourplexes in all districts served by water and sewer. Much of Vermont is still on septic, so it's really quite a progressive change. It reduces, and Vermont is also a Dillon rule state, so a lot of zoning reform has to happen or be enabled at the state level. And it reduces parking minimums, setbacks, and lot coverage statewide. So we're very hopeful for what will come out of that. And I just want to read something that Representative Seth Bongart said from the floor during adoption. He was the architect of the municipal reforms. And to quote him, he said, large lot sizes, excess parking requirements, excess setbacks, height limitations, all drive up costs to make it harder for low and even moderate income people to be able to live in the communities in which they work. A real community has people of all incomes living and working together as neighbors. And so I love that comment because as we're talking about inclusionary zoning or equitable zoning, it really frames that very well. So just briefly, based on the work that the Congress for New Urbanism has done, I would like to address or identify some barriers to equity in zoning. And for those of you at the municipal level, these are things that you understand very well. As early 20th century zoning was applied to historic urban fabric, it created many non-conforming lot sizes, lot coverage restrictions, mismatched density requirements once dwelling units per acre was overlaid with bulk standards. There needs to be matching dimensional requirements to existing conditions, permitting secondary principal buildings, and removing unnecessary architectural requirements in many situations. And so making existing conditions legal is one of the easy fixes for making your zoning where you work and live more equitable. The next thing is perhaps one of the greatest barriers to equity and zoning are parking standards. And we've been doing reviews for the city of Milwaukee recently, and Milwaukee has incredibly progressive parking standards relative to the national scale, but still, even then, the professional recommendation was to remove or reduce minimum on-site requirements. Like Milwaukee already allows on-street parking to count, but most municipalities do not. And one thing that is crucial to the removal of conflict between pedestrians and cyclists with automobile is to require that on-site parking be located behind the building. And I think one thing that many of us fail to acknowledge is that parking requirements are really a hidden barrier to equity. They are assuring that the people that live in certain areas have the same income, that it drives up the cost of providing parking on site, drives up the cost of housing, and the cost of automobile ownership, of course, reduces livable income. And so with those two things together, parking reductions in general should be a priority for your community if you're looking for equitable zoning. The next item is allowable uses, and expanding housing choice is probably the first one. And those were issues that I covered in those different state examples that are good case studies, because exclusionary zoning for single family detached is ubiquitous in this country. And it's extremely limiting of income, socioeconomic status in general, and it's even racially exclusive. And so as we begin to expand housing choice, that enables our communities to become more equitable places. And avoiding artificial determination of family composition. This is something that was baked into our zoning codes in the early to mid 20th century, and determining how many people with what relationships can live together in itself is inequitable, especially as we're looking at new family compositions where people are choosing to live with roommates rather than family members. And finally, permitting residential uses in urban centers and downtowns is something that was a product of late 20th century zoning. And all of these are actually historically exclusionary tactics. So as you look at your goals for equity, considering what your allowable uses are should be a priority. And finally, the issue of accessory dwelling units. It was a bit of a surprise to us because working in Milwaukee, the code in general is really very progressive. It achieves most of the goals that we attempt to achieve professionally. But one thing that's still missing is accessory dwelling units. And then even communities that have them, frequently they don't allow the owner to transition as they age over time to occupy the ADU. Many communities we have worked for require the primary dwelling to be occupied by the owner. And that doesn't acknowledge changing demographics. And finally, increasing the permissible areas of ADUs. So often those are defined at a very small scale. And so that is one area in which equity could be very much improved. These are critical solutions to aging in place, and groups like AARP are huge advocates for this. And we would recommend that in your communities that you consider that as an option. The final issue I want to talk about is the development review process. Reducing conditional use and discretionary site plan approval requirements is a crucial way to take what should be a by right application out of public dialogue, and it keeps it from being exposed to non-professional critique. Simplifying small-scale development application requirements is another way to build equity into your codes, because that empowers smaller developments to be able to do incremental housing and development in general. And finally, defining and permitting limited deviations for specific reasons actually puts back on your professional staff the ability to make a decision based on professional criteria rather than public opinion. And these are all, once again, through the development process, they're historically exclusionary tactics that can, with relative ease, be removed. So just the final, this is like the, if you do nothing else, do this. These are what are the reduced barrier to entry with these 3 amendments to your zoning code. So replacing density controls with bulk standards, allowing buildings of compatible mass within the same zoning districts, regardless of the number of units. And this enables developers to be more responsive to the market and to be able to densify urban centers and make transit more affordable and attainable. Reducing or removing on-site parking requirements in walkable context and all of your climate change mitigation goals, that would be of primary concern. And then finally, allowing ADUs by right. If you encourage those, municipalities can create many more opportunities for compact, affordable housing that's actually integrated into existing neighborhoods. So with that, I will stop sharing.
So Susan, as Sam starts putting his presentation up, just a quick question on ADUs. We've had students doing research, we've talked to developers, and it's not always considered affordable, truly affordable. Do you have any strategies for communities to consider so that it really is affordable, other than just more a rental or secondary unit?
Well, one thing that and that's true, and it's a very valid and important critique. One thing that we have found, though, especially in the context of aging parents and being cared for by their adult children, sorry, I don't mean this in a pejorative manner, but failure to launch kids that are still benefiting from being attached to their parents. In situations such as that, it's not necessarily, the goal isn't necessarily affordability, it's functionality. And so there are many ways in which ADUs can help solve housing problems and equitable issues without necessarily solving the affordability issue.
Thank you, appreciate that perspective. Sam, pass it to you.
Well, thank you, Carolyn, and thank you, Susan. One thing I'll just add, since this is, I know, a statewide APA event, is a lot of the work that we've been taking on locally in Milwaukee has also been guided by, some of the work that Placemakers, DPZ, and others did through the Enabling Better Places document that APA helped sponsor. So I think as APA members statewide, we should all be thankful that kind of our professional association has been moving that discussion forward. And it's certainly a tool that we've been using. And I'm glad that APA sponsored that. And, obviously Placemakers was a lead author of that, as well as supporting our work in Milwaukee that we're going to talk about a little bit now. So with that, I do want to talk about growing MKE. What is growing MKE? In a big picture, it's a really exciting time to be talking about what we envision our future of housing growth and choice to be in Milwaukee. We've all talked at a high level. I mean, everyone who kind of follows Milwaukee knows that we have still a relatively new mayor who has ambitious goals for growth and development. And his goals are including asking all of our departments to act with a growth mentality. What would it look like to plan and implement strategies that anticipate we will continue to grow? Because we know we need to grow for fiscal reasons, for environmental reasons, and for all other reasons about wanting the Milwaukee to continue to grow and be vibrant. The mayor has ambitious goals that rely on that. And so as part of that, he's made commitments to build out 50 miles of protected bike lanes. We're being aggressive about recruiting companies to locate in downtown Milwaukee, where we're envisioning double the amount of population and jobs. And one element of that is making sure that our policies and regulations for housing development, whether it's through our comprehensive plan or our zoning code, align with those goals. And you all are planners, so you know that that's the high level. The tactics of how you get there is we want to carry out an amendment to our citywide policy plan, which is part of our comprehensive plan, to make sure that our big picture land use and policy goals align with those growth goals for housing growth and choice. And we want to use the results of that effort, the updated policy plan, to carry out actual zoning code text amendments to make sure that our zoning regulations align with our visionary goals. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about those goals because that's what informs a lot of this work. Obviously, Mayor Johnson has talked about wanting to see the city grow, and part of his economic prosperity vision is ensuring that our zoning code aligns with those growth goals. But it's not just about growth, it's also about ensuring that our regulations and our policies align with our climate equity goals. Milwaukee recently approved a climate equity plan that had 10 big ideas. One of those big ideas was reducing vehicle miles traveled and ensuring that our development patterns and future housing development align with those goals, including ensuring that our zoning code supports the kind of development that will allow us to execute on our climate equity goals. Similarly, like a lot of you, we're focused on the issue of affordable housing. We recently completed a collective affordable housing strategic plan with a lot of the key housing stakeholders in the area, which identified a series of strategies to advance our housing affordability goals. One of the supporting strategies there was ensuring that our zoning code aligns with permitting the types of housing options and choices in a wide range of neighborhoods that may allow for some reduced housing costs. And I want to pause on that because I know the topic of this presentation today is equitable zoning. We fully acknowledge that if you're serious about housing affordability and serious about equity in housing and zoning and development, zoning is one very, very small piece of the puzzle, especially in a city like Milwaukee with our significant needs for affordable housing. We chose, rather than to lead with a zoning solution, we led with creating that collective affordable housing strategic plan. We know if we're serious about achieving our ambitious goals there, zoning is not the answer. The answer is continuing to create or implement over all the variety of strategies that we've identified to increase and preserve Black and Latino homeownership, create and preserve affordable housing. And we won't talk about that at length during this presentation, but I do want to make sure we're touching on that because as a planner, I do think if we're serious about the equitable part of this presentation topic, we have to acknowledge that zoning alone won't do it. And I hope that municipalities across the state are not kind of putting all the eggs in one basket, so to speak, and assuming that zoning code updates alone will achieve the other goals we have for housing equity and affordability. There needs to be paired strategies. I think we all know that, but I think it's important to say. So I think Susan actually, her presentation set this up very well as far as her national scan of best practices, both what other cities are doing and laying out, kind of the recommendations that they have made across the country, whether it's through her work or CNU. And we've carried out some of our own analysis, some of it with the help of Placemakers, a lot of it with the internal team we have here at DCD Planning, to look at how does our zoning code already align with our goals for housing growth and choice. And the good news is, as Susan alluded to, we're in a really strong place because of our progressive history of planning and leadership, both historically over the last few decades and then over the last few years as well. We have a comprehensive plan and a zoning code that are already very well tailored to support walkable urban neighborhoods. And so we're starting from a really good place. We've seen the development of over 20,000 new units of housing over the past 20 years, and that has happened across the city at a variety of scales. But like many of you, we've seen a lot of that development clustered in either single-family new construction or larger multifamily developments. Just like so many across the country, we've not necessarily seen missing middle housing. And we acknowledge that's not just because of zoning issues, there's economics at play there too. We are a city that doesn't have the same market as many of the cities that you see, large demand for growth. And so we have to acknowledge too, there's economic issues that will impact what gets built here in Milwaukee. But that said, when we talk about why we're operating from a position of already progressive tradition and strength, we're already a city of diverse housing options. More than half of our residentially zoned parcels allow 2 or more units, including the parts of the city that are most well served by transit, and we have the most vacant lots. We already do permit multifamily housing in all of our commercial corridors, districts, and our downtown. So mixed use is baked into the code, which is, again, why you've seen a lot of that really vibrant, walkable development over the years. Susan alluded to the fact that we have among the lowest parking requirements in the nation. I think of the cities that haven't fully removed them, I've never seen a city that has lower requirements in their base zoning districts for parking. And we provide bonuses for areas near transit and shared parking. So as we've kind of done our initial analysis and talked to developers, they've not necessarily identified that as a barrier, but obviously it's one we want to continue to focus on to make sure we're not doing anything that encourages over parking. We also have a by right development code, which means proposals meeting the code don't require discretionary reviews. And we have design standards in the code that advance a lot of our goals for walkable urban development. But that said, we're also taking on this project to look at areas where there might be potential barriers in the code that don't align exactly with our goals for housing growth and choice that have been articulated through whether it's our area planning process or some of those plans I mentioned earlier. One thing that is, of course, of great interest to anyone who's working on this issue around the state, there's always the question of single family zoning districts. In Milwaukee, we do have 40% of our residentially zoned parcels that allow only one housing unit currently. As Susan alluded to, there's nowhere in the city right now where you can develop an ADU as of right, though there are areas that you could do it through conditional uses, and it's a housing type that we have frequently seen throughout city neighborhoods. But over time, the code was changed to be a little bit more restrictive than it had been historically for ADUs. We also acknowledge that there may be zoning districts where some of our density controls through lot area per dwelling unit or floor area ratio, some of our standards in the code don't exactly align with the goals we have for housing growth and choice that have been articulated in our comprehensive planning documents. So for example, we might have commercial corridors where area plans call for high density mixed use development, but where the underlying density requirements in the code don't allow that without either a zoning change or a BOZA variance. And so one of the long-term goals is to align those factors. We also, when you talk about missing middle styles of housing, while there are parts of the city that allow a wide variety of housing styles, we acknowledge that there are a fair amount of the city that they're not permitted. And we know that those are housing types that are in demand, they're desired, and we want to make sure that we've enabled them in places throughout the city where they could meet some of our housing needs. So what's the process we've been undertaking to try to advance those goals? And I think, as all of you know, none of this is easy. I want to just be really upfront. I know there was some media coverage more recently about some of our recommendations that made it seem like we're maybe farther along than we are. We have been working for the past 6 months to carry out this process. We've led it with a significant amount of support from our Department of City Development staff. All of us in planning have been working on this. This touches everything we do in planning. We've also engaged the consultant team of Placemakers and DPZ to support that. We've hired an engagement consultant to help with some of our engagement efforts. We've convened a community and technical advisory committee, and we have an internal working group that's been meeting once a month to hash out some of the more complex issues that come up in a project like this. So where we are in that process is we're now starting to talk about some of our preliminary recommendations. That's very different than a final proposal. We acknowledge that. We want to get feedback from the public. We want to hear what we've gotten right, what resonates with people, or where we could continue to refine this before we bring a comprehensive planning amendment to our Common Council. So as all of you know, engagement in this work is critical. The APA Guide for Equity in Zoning talked about the importance of engagement as you do carry out code update projects like this. We've attempted to be thoughtful about that and follow some of the guidance in that APA Zoning for Equity Guide. We've been lucky enough to get support philanthropically from some partners who've supported, given us some additional resources to carry out that engagement. We've been popping up at office hours in all of the city's libraries, our senior centers. We've had kind of the traditional evening open houses. We've done online work, online surveys, and we're going to be doing even more of that in the next month. And I'll plug at the end of this ways for you to get engaged if you're in the Milwaukee area and want to participate. We've continued to hear from people that the topics of housing diversity, affordability, and growth do resonate. And I think that obviously means something different to everyone. I don't want to say we've heard with unanimity, everyone calling for a certain thing, but those are the general topics that there has been consensus about, as well as this idea that people want to be able to walk to amenities in their neighborhood. And then I think it's our job as planners to help make that case that if at a big picture, you support walkable urban neighborhoods and diversity of housing choices within your neighborhood, we as the city, we as planners have to deliver a regulatory framework that enables that and doesn't prohibit it. And that's what we're going to be working on in the next phase. And so what are some of the recommendations we're considering? I'll walk through those now. Again, I want to credit these were prepared with the input of the Placemakers consultant team, as well as input provided by our past area plans, the outreach we've gotten to date, our community and technical advisory committee, and a variety of other factors. The goals are all arranged around a few key priorities, and these shouldn't be a surprise. These are all the things we do all the time as planners. We talk about the goals of wanting to have housing diversity. We talk about walkability. Any change we made should be made with the idea that we want to continue to ensure our neighborhoods are walkable urban neighborhoods. That's one of the things we hear the most from the public, and we want to make sure that any proposed changes support that increased density to allow people to live closer to services and amenities. We want to make sure any changes advance our goals for climate action, and that our zoning code aligns with the fact that as we grow, we know that those growth patterns will have impacts on the climate, and we need to be prepared for that as we grow. Similarly, we know that housing diversity creates options across a variety of size and budget requirements, and we want to ensure our code supports that, as well as the human diversity that comes along with that. And so what are those recommendations? I mean, we want to go back to touching on the fact that Milwaukee was historically built as a city with a mix of housing types. You could go in many neighborhoods in the city and see single family, duplex, 4-unit, and apartment buildings coexisting on the same block. And we want to make sure that our code continues to permit some degree of that throughout the city, and that every city neighborhood should allow for some level of housing choice. Their types of housing units we want to ensure. I mean, these types of graphics are all familiar to many of you. You know what the housing types are and that exist, and these are all things that exist historically in Milwaukee. And so one of our recommendations would be in all residentially zoned areas, including parts of the city that are currently zoned only for single family homes, that we would permit single family, duplex, triplex, and all styles of ADUs. And again, you all know the terms ADUs inside and out, and this would include both detached and external ADUs. We do think that that's something that should be permitted throughout the city, and we already have examples of those. Similarly, for townhomes, we'd like to see those in city neighborhoods across the city, not just neighborhoods that are higher density single and two-family districts where they're currently allowed. We also are recommending that duplexes and triplexes be allowed in our current single-family districts. And that's something we're going to be interested to see people's reaction to that. I know that that's a type of recommendation that has caused controversy across the country, and we're going to be starting to talk about more publicly that concept over the next few weeks and months, and interested to see the feedback as far as what we hear from the public on that. We also have areas of the city that are currently zoned for two-family residential. We want to allow fourplexes throughout that area. Again, we already allow that in a large portion of the city, but there are parts of the city where currently only allow duplexes. We're recommending fourplexes be added to that permitted use mix there. And then within the areas of the city that are most well served by transit, are historically developed neighborhoods that currently already allow 4 units as of right. We do want to increase the permissions for small apartment buildings there, small apartment buildings of the size and scale that blend in with existing neighborhoods, like those examples you see there. If we're serious about our goals for density, we do want to implement the recommendation Susan mentioned earlier on this idea that rather than regulate the number of homes that can be permitted in a building strictly through the mathematical standards around lot area per dwelling unit, we want to use the building envelope and bulk standards to control that and eliminate the lot area per dwelling unit requirements from the code. And that would apply in the areas where we allow multifamily housing. With that, we want to give predictability on design. We want to continue to update our design standards for things like building facades, window articulation. I mean, we already regulate all these things through the code, but as we're talking about being more permissive and more predictable for the types and styles of multifamily developments that are encouraged, we want to build additional design standards in the code to deliver the types of products, the types of housing products that we're working hard to achieve already through our various discretionary review processes and design review processes. So with that, I'll close out. That's my time. I just want to end with kind of the high level, the why again. The why we're doing this is to achieve those overall city priorities around housing growth, housing choice, affordability, and climate equity. So with that, I'll thank you, and I look forward to kind of taking questions in the Q&A part.
Sam, quick question. I've heard this previously, and it's also posted in the chat while Tammy transitions. The question of triplex, anything triplex and larger triggers a different building code, which is more restrictive. So it treats it like a commercial building. how will the city address that? Because that's beyond a city policy.
Great question. Yeah, I think there's two ways to address that. One is, yeah, that's absolutely right. Enabling some of these styles of housing doesn't mean they're going to get built. A lot of them are economically challenging to build, especially right when you go above 2 units and move into commercial construction. So we do think that it's probably true that you're not going to see a lot of triplexes get built in the short term. That doesn't mean we should make them illegal. And the second answer is, I do think over time, we as a profession are going to probably need to continue to advocate for changes to the statewide building code. That I know I've seen, other states that have taken this issue on around housing growth and choice have acknowledged that one of the barriers we probably need to reduce is that barrier in the building code. And so there's been people who are smarter than me on building code issues who have successfully advocated for tweaks that still adhere to all the safety standards you need, from a public health, safety, welfare standpoint, but have changed that threshold for how many units trigger compliance with the commercial code. And I think we want to set up our code to be focused on what should be permitted from a zoning standpoint, with the potential that if there is future changes to the building code, we haven't artificially prohibited units that we think make sense from a land use standpoint.
Thank you. I think we'll also learn from other states and what they're doing. All right, thank you. Our final speaker, a little further along in this process, but still going through implementation, is the city of Wauwatosa. So Tammy, passing it to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn. Last but not least. Hi, everyone. I'm Tammy Szudy. I'm the Planning and Zoning Manager for the city of Wauwatosa. And I'll be sharing our Zonetosa for All Equitable Zoning and Land Use Initiative that was completed a little over 2 years ago. And I'm going to turn my camera off just so you guys don't have to stare at the side of my face, but I'll put my camera back on when I'm done. On just a moment. All right, so backing up a little bit for those who don't know about Wauwatosa. Wauwatosa is central to the Metro Milwaukee region, and we're a destination retail and office development center. Our resident population is 48,000 persons, but it doubles during the day because of the Milwaukee Regional Medical Center, Mayfair Mall, and other large employers and destinations. We are also a fully built out community, so our development opportunities are redevelopment in nature, and much of our housing stock is single family. So why Zonetosa for All? As I mentioned, we did this about 2 years ago in late 2020. 2 years ago we completed it, late 2021. So we started this because our Common Council's Committee of the Whole identified several initiatives in 2020 as key to advancing equity. After they held a series of equity and inclusion conversations with members of the community that were facilitated by the Zeidler Group. And from these conversations, the inequities of greatest concern were addressing housing needs, increasing the number of minority-owned businesses, evolving police services, accessibility for persons with disabilities, enhancing city communications, and diversifying our workplace. So range of priorities, not all zoning related, but this was what got us to start the review and the identification of changes in zoning and our development practices to ensure that we are truly zoned for all. The photo on the right on the slide, so that was a welcome sign in Wauwatosa years ago, illustrating how zoning was not only used to exclude, but also advertised as such in Wauwatosa. So we want to move away from that and have tried, but there's more we can do. And as far as we're aware, at least in this region, we were one of the first communities, if not the first, to undertake this type of review of our zoning and land use policies. So here's a quick overview of our process. First, we hired a consultant. We engaged a consulting team, Duncan Associates, P3 Development Group, and altogether a placemaking and design studio, because we specifically wanted partners who were familiar with zoning, but also had the ability to facilitate conversations that could be sensitive or difficult, and also technical in nature. Zoning can be confusing to many. And while city staff were involved and we had improvement ideas, we intentionally wanted to take a step back to hear from the community and base our recommendations from those that are impacted by our policies. And we needed to have the right partners to help us with this process. As mentioned, equity and inclusion conversations stemmed in late 2020, and we started this process in early 2021. So we were in a pandemic. People were just venturing out a bit more after a year of uncertainty and being locked up. And while we were further along with virtual engagement than we were early in the pandemic, we were still working through kinks and figuring out how to get participation and how to get good, meaningful participation, especially around zoning. Third, after we held a series of public engagement participation efforts that I'll get into in a moment, zoning and communication recommendations were developed. And these recommendations were presented to our Common Council in October 2021. And finally, implementation. Since we published the report, we've been working on implementing many of the recommendations, some as zoning text amendments, and we continue to work with elected officials to see more implemented. But backing up, public participation. So as I mentioned, we truly wanted to hear from the community and base our recommendations from the feedback. The city, alongside our consultants, we designed an engagement process that involved various voices from the community, and we collected input around zoning, land use, and city communications through multiple participation efforts over a 6-month time frame. And prior to any public engagement, we established a project webpage to house everything related to the initiative, and we developed a branding theme as shown on the bottom slide. And after those items were set, in April 2021, we launched 6 focus group meetings and had 33 participants who were chosen because of their unique and perspectives and representation within the community. So these were elected officials, appointed officials, residents, business owners, county representatives, school board members, members from senior and disability organizations, developers, Fair Housing Council members, and WIDA representatives. And following the focus groups, we launched the Myth versus Fact informational social media campaign, which is shown on the right. This captured stories from the community and lived experiences from persons in the community regarding accessibility, affordability, and belonging. And this all led up to our first virtual public workshop, and 71 people attended, and they engaged in facilitated breakout room conversations. They shared their experiences and perspectives on zoning and land use and contributed ideas to aim at positively impacting our community's growth. And finally, the last part of phase 1 public participation was an online survey for those who couldn't attend or wanted to provide individual feedback. And we had 98 responses, and the survey featured questions related to themes that were discussed in the workshop, including how often people attend meetings, reasons for attending, barriers, how they hear about meetings, and other ideas for improvement. So from the first stage of our public participation efforts, some overarching themes emerged, which established 5 project goals to serve as the basis for the report recommendations and our future approach. The goals were supporting and encouraging local business growth, creating policies that allow for a range of housing options and ensure discrimination is not a barrier, ensuring all residents have equal access to housing, parks, and transportation, increasing accessibility for persons with disabilities, and creating a structure to review zoning and land use decisions through an equity framework. So once these goals were set, our consulting partners went to work reviewing our code and procedures, and they developed a range of recommendations related to these goals. And after that, we held another round of public participation and engagement efforts. In late July of 2021, again, we held 2 focus groups where we reviewed the draft recommendations and discussed engagement strategies for workshops. And then in August, we had an outdoor, in-person, and we also had a virtual public workshop to review the draft recommendations and provide feedback. In total, 55 people attended those workshops. And then we had a second online survey that was taken by 111 participants that listed the draft recommendations and asked each participant to specify their level of support. And the presentation board, as shown on the left, was also displayed in the library during this time to encourage others to take the survey and provide input. And then finally, concurrent with the workshops and the survey, we launched another social media campaign to explain the nuances of zoning, address questions about the recommendations, and engage the community in a visual way. So from that, what were the Wauwatosa for All recommendations? There were 5 recommendations regarding engagement and communication. And for each of the recommendations, as the slide shows on the right, the report describes why it matters, and the recommendations for communications also indicate the budget, administrative time, and a department lead, and also if it's something's being done similarly in another city. And the check mark on the slide on the left shows that we've implemented at least some form or fashion of the recommendation. So the first recommendation was increasing awareness about when meetings are happening and what is being discussed by posting agendas earlier or using software that allows users to submit comments. The second is combating planning fatigue, and this includes establishing internal staff meetings to plan engagement efforts, add active development and zoning projects to our website, and create a filterable calendar for city meetings. The third is spreading the word about development-related public meetings through existing communication channels by using Facebook events and ads at targeted geographic areas, along with building trust and boosting participation with a communication network of community organizations to spread the word. The fourth one was expanding our engagement offerings and begin earlier in the process. This one actually has 4 parts, and it's mostly about developers and requiring them to engage residents and owners earlier in the process. The city should provide guidelines to developers for engaging the community and require developers to use digital engagement software in addition to print and in-person engagement. And then also having the city invest in engagement software. And then the final engagement and communication recommendation was educate the public on zoning and its importance. And going to public events and educating people about the calendar and such. So zoning recommendations, there are 18 of them. And some of them you've heard Susan and Sam discuss already, so I apologize for duplication, but it's a common theme. So again, with the zoning recommendations, the report describes why it matters and what other cities, if any, are doing, and the check mark next to the recommendation indicates we've completed some part of implementation. So the first one for us was expand our public hearing notice by mailing notices to occupants in addition to owners, and also requiring posting signs at project sites. The next one was to use the same minimum lot size for duplexes and single unit detached houses. Right now we require a larger lot size for properties with 2 dwellings, so it recommends just using the same lot size as those with 1 unit. Third was removing the artificial limits on density and instead focus on the building size and scale, as Susan and Sam have already discussed. As Susan also mentioned, next was to amend the definition of household. So our current definition is any number of individuals related by blood, marriage, or adoption living together, and also up to 3 additional persons not related to them. So the recommendation is to allow any number of adults if they function as a nonprofit housekeeping unit, and then to provide a definition of nonprofit housekeeping unit. Moving on was to consolidate and simplify our group living uses. This has 3 parts, which the first was to simplify the categories into 2 types, congregate living and residential care. The second was to allow these facilities by right in some zoning districts. And the third piece was to remove the spacing restrictions that we have for some facilities so they do not have to obtain a conditional use approval. The next one was ADUs. So this has been discussed as well. And to allow larger ADUs and to publicize our program. We've actually allowed ADUs since 2016, but our report recommended increasing the allowed size up to 900 square feet or the first floor area of the principal dwelling unit, whichever is less. Again, heard this from others, reduce the minimum motor vehicle parking requirements by eliminating the minimum ratio for small dwelling units, and also reduce the minimum parking requirements overall and consolidate them into fewest categories possible. Number 8 is to update our bike parking regulations to add long-term bike parking requirements. We already had short-term, and this also recommended updating our minimum bike parking ratios. The next one is to add a reasonable accommodation procedure. This is to establish a process to administratively grant relief to individuals with disabilities or developers of housing for persons with disabilities, so they don't have to go through the variance approval process through our Board of Zoning Appeals or some other relief body. And moving on, this was also mentioned, reduce reliance on conditional uses. Consider reclassifying some as permitted uses. The next one is revising the R2 district, which is our 1 and 2 unit district, to prevent more missing middle housing, to allow 3 and 4 unit residential buildings and or cottage courts to be built in these districts. And next was study the possibility of applying more R2 zoning in more areas of the city as part of our comprehensive plan, based on transit access or other factors. Moving on is to revise the planned unit development overlay to specifically address affordable housing, to consider the production of affordable housing as a public benefit, which may justify the approval of a planned unit development project. And recommendation 14 was to amend our zoning approval criteria to include the consideration of possible equity impacts. This recommends amending our rezoning, conditional use, and our PUD process to expressly address the proposed development's expected impact on the loss of naturally occurring affordable housing and resident displacement. And then finally, we had 4 technical cleanup items, which were amend lot definition to allow some situations for deeded street access instead of actual street access, allow staff approval of lot line adjustments instead of having the common council approve them, clarify our regulations to split zone parcels, and streamline our process of setting public hearing dates. So a range of recommendations, some that are best practices nationally, and as the check mark indicates, we've implemented quite a few of them. So the lessons learned from this process, or maybe the realities, as illustrated, we've implemented many, but not all, and the reasons being staff, funding, and other priorities. As with many government entities, we have limited financial and staff resources. Some of the recommendations from the Zone TOSA for All report involve research, which could mean hiring consultants or dedicating more staff time than is available. And there's always another priority around the corner. For us, we're initiating a new comprehensive plan right now per the direction of our common council. So that's allocating scarce resources. Second, there's the political environment. There's always political realities. And in April 2022, which was just 6 months after this report was presented, more than half of our common council was new with varying levels of zoning and planning experience. And we also have very many new plan commission members. I believe 6 of the 7 were new in the last few years. So there's an overall education component. And then finally, the recommendations we implemented were maybe considered the low-hanging fruit or less controversial or easier to adopt. But with this approach, we implemented over half. So the lesson is do what you can. You have to start somewhere. Incremental change is okay. And then finally, as Sam said, let's remember that zoning is just one piece of this puzzle. As I said, we've had accessory dwelling units since 2016, but we've only seen 3 built. And while we implemented the Zone TOSA for All recommendation about increasing the allowed size, the largest obstacle that we found, it's not zoning, it's building codes and the overall affordability or lack of affordability to construct ADUs. And I'm wrapping up. With that said, while a more equitable approach to zoning and land use and development won't solve all our equity issues, a concerted effort to integrate equity into planning efforts and zoning decisions will provide opportunities that didn't previously exist. And so to wrap it up, because I said a lot, but there's a lot more in our report. You can find the report on our website, which is wauwatosa.net, and just search Zone TOSA for All. Thank you.
Thank you, Tammy. I think what's encouraging between all 3 of you is that there's a lot of overlap, right? So across the country, we're seeing some consistency on issues to increase the equity within communities. But of course, there's the challenge of if we don't have the parcels available, we can have these recommendations, but buildings might not be built, or the ADUs, as you're saying, aren't added. So we do have some of those challenges that all communities will have. One question I do want to pose to the group, I realize we have maybe about 5 minutes before people are dropping off, is related to the parking. And Tammy, if you want to stop sharing so we can see the speakers, that would work well.
Sorry.
Parking is different in each of your communities. For example, in Wauwatosa, I know there's a discussion on parking because there's no overnight parking permitted in the residential areas. And when you look at equity, you might allow on-street parking to reduce the amount of, garages or off-street accommodations that are required. But in the city of Milwaukee, as pointed out in a chat, the streets are filled, right? And how do you manage that within the proposed guidelines that are being proposed? So Tammy, if you just want to address what's being done in Tulsa, then we'll pass it to Sam. And if Susan has any general comments about parking.
Yes, so we will be looking at reducing through the zoning code, the required off-street parking. But as far as parking on the street, that's not a zoning decision. It's our Department of Public Works. And so far they've been, for lack of a better word, resistant to it for operations that need to happen during the night. But yeah, we do not allow on-street parking between, I think, 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. So you need to find a place to put your car if you have one.
And I think from Milwaukee's perspective, yeah, as I said, the one good thing, we already believe that we're not requiring more parking than developers are generally building. So we're not creating excess parking through our code, which is a good thing. Our climate and equity plan that was recently adopted did contain a recommendation that was adopted by our Common Council that we should explore strategies to continue to either reduce or eliminate parking requirements. And so that's a policy direction that we want to figure out how to best advance. It is an important thing from a climate and housing choice standpoint. We also know it's a complex topic with a lot of opinions. And so I think we're using this process to get people's feedback on the overall topic. And then we're going to need to figure out, how do you kind of continue to make sure that our parking regulations align with our overall goals and don't force the creation of any excess parking, knowing the challenges that has. So I think that's just a discussion we're going to continue to have with our public and our policymakers. And I've been also excited nationally when you look at cities who have looked at that issue more holistically and said, how do you also tackle the issue of parking requirements while you're looking at TDM strategies, while you're looking at on-street parking strategies, and knowing that as planners, we're often interdisciplinary holistic thinkers, probably need to look at those things combined, given how much they impact each other.
And I don't think it's always necessarily a blanket approach. As pointed out, we have a lot of out-of-state students attending UWN and probably also Marquette and MSOE, and they can't get a parking permit if they're out of state. So it may be different rules for different locations of the city, and then especially as you look at equity and density. Susan, do you have anything to add in terms of the parking strategies?
Yeah, just the general best practice is moving toward getting out of the business. It's not that parking isn't required. It's just that it's regulated by a couple of other things. The first being market, in that most intelligent developers don't build something they can't rent or sell. Therefore, they build the parking that it takes to make it profitable. And secondly, the financing arm. So if you're going to finance your development, then most often your financer will require a certain amount of parking. So it's just a redundancy on the part of the city. And the city usually doesn't have the skills nor the money to do the studies to actually determine how much parking is required. So our best practice is just to let the people do it that are already doing it and don't be redundant.
I know a lot of city strategies are let the market determine what is needed or not needed. I do think there is a question, though, about availability of land. In both these scenarios, communities are mostly built out. So we can have a missing middle strategy and approach for the triplexes or fourplexes, but if we don't have land available, has that been part of your discussions? Is this allowing if somebody is going to tear down a vacant building, or how are these strategies accommodated and then ultimately implemented?
We've talked about it a little bit, and one of our challenges is, if we implement some of these strategies to allow it, it probably would be a redevelopment opportunity, but our values are so high, so the cost return really isn't there, especially if someone's trying to provide affordable housing. Same with ADU, just the cost of constructing and adding utilities or separating HVAC systems. It's just not worth it to what we've seen so far. But we still will try to make the change, and if anything, it'll be incremental change for equity issues.
Yep, I've heard that. Sam or Susan?
Yeah, I mean, I think we would assume change would also likely occur incrementally, just given, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of our city, our most common zoning district, including in a lot of our most high value real estate market neighborhoods, already allow 4 units as of right, and we're not necessarily seeing that kind of redevelopment. We do think that we don't want to restrict future opportunities for small scale infill redevelopment, just knowing that the cities that have taken that option as they've grown, the impact has been significantly increased housing costs. And so we understand that those things you have to balance, and knowing our goals for growth, we want to make sure that our land use and zoning policies aren't restricting that in a way that will also have negative impacts as far as housing costs. So it's a balancing test, and it's one that, obviously we're continuing to monitor and try to be thoughtful about.
Susan, before I jump to you, I'm just going to say that we will probably have a survey, but I think I'll post a survey in the link to give us feedback on today's session, but also give us some suggestions for alternative speakers, topics. Because we're virtual, we are really excited when we have people nationally that can join this conversation. So let us know your ideas on that. And a reminder, December 6th will be our next Innovative Cities lecture, and November 30th, if you can join us in person at 4 p.m. So Susan, do you have any final comments before I do a
No,
quick thank?
that's great.
Yeah, I really appreciate the three of you spending time with us, and for everybody who's joined us for this lunch hour. This is a very current topic, and we know it's challenging at times, but I think, as Tammy said, incremental steps are really important in showing that there is some progress. So appreciate. We will send a recording link when it's live on our website, and include a lot of the links that those of you have been sharing with us. We appreciate the additional resources that you're sharing as well. So thank you, and forward with good planning. Thank you.